Good evening. My name is Mark Dunlea. I'm Secretary of the EcoAction Committee of the Green Party United States. And welcome to our webinar on COP30. It's in Brazil, started tonight, November 10th. We're going to have four presenters this evening, and I'll give more of their bios when we introduce them. Rachel Ruback, who's with the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty campaign, Holly Kaufman with Plastic and Climate Project, J.L. Andrepont, who is with 350.org, and then to talk a little bit about what's going on with the COP on biodiversity. COP30 in Brazil is about climate. Will be Maureen Doyle, who's a member of the EcoAction Committee of the Green Party. Key issues at COP30 will include the energy transition, hopefully, phasing out fossil fuels and increase in renewables, climate finance, especially for developing nations, and updated national climate plans that are actually much more ambitious and actionable. Frankly, the ones that have emerged prior to the COP have been quite disappointing. The conference also will focus on adaptation to climate change, and particularly nature-based solutions given the location in the Amazon. The recent State of Climate Action 225 report, 2025, prepared by the World Resources Institute, found that in every single sector, climate action has failed to materialize at the level required to achieve the Paris Climate Agreement goals, and none of the 45 indicators are on track to reach the 1.5 degrees warming target, which was what the developing world kind of forced countries like the United States to accept in Paris. And in fact, for the last 2 years, we have been at the 1.5 or even past the 1.5 target. One standout initiative is the TFFF, a Brazil-led blended finance mechanism designed to reward tropical nations for forest-related conservation effort. The proposal seeks to compensate countries for preserving tropical forests with 20% of funds reserved specifically for payments to indigenous peoples. So we start off with Rachel Ruback, who is the global coordinator or a global coordinator at the Fossil Fuel Treaty Initiative. She's a climate justice campaigner, bringing together her academic background and global health and policy, and her experience building grassroots movements gearing towards community care and collective resilience to fight for a just transition away from the fossil fuel economy and the extractive systems it relies on, particularly within North America. So, Rachel Ruback.
My role has been within North America, helping our broad network campaigning for the Fossil Fuel Treaty. But based on some exciting updates that I'll share a little bit more later on, that role is expanding a bit globally, which is why I am here at COP this year. So maybe just a few things to touch on, building on what was mentioned earlier about COP. So I'll presume most of you have some baseline familiarity with the UNFCCC, which is the major climate treaty framework that we have, and the Paris Agreement, which is an agreement that was negotiated under the UNFCCC 10 years ago, which set the target that we would try to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. And so every year, the parties to that treaty meet in a different country at what is known as the Conference of Parties, or COP. Based on the fact that we'll be talking about the Convention on Biological Diversity later, it's important to note that it's not the only treaty framework that holds COPs. So this is the climate COP, and there have been 30 of them. So they have been meeting my entire lifetime to try to do something about climate change, and here we are. And so, yeah, this year it's being held in Belém, Brazil, which is, exciting for a couple of reasons. It's a COP that is a much larger focus on indigenous populations and indigenous engagement. And there's a lot of really great movement work that is happening here that it's exciting to be a part of. But also, this COP is happening against the backdrop of this year was the first year that there's different ways of measuring how global temperatures, but this is the first year that we have breached 1.5 degrees. The goal still is, yeah, we have not technically blown through 1.5, but we have breached 1.5 for the first time. And obviously, we are in a much shakier multilateralism situation now compared to previous COPs, although, yeah, global international cooperation is always a little bit complicated. But yeah, so a couple of things that are the fossil fuel treaty campaign is really focusing on this year is the need for countries to come together to agree to phase out fossil fuel production entirely. As you may know, fossil fuels are responsible for 86% of carbon emissions, and yet the first time they were really formally mentioned they're not formally mentioned in the UNFCCC text or in the Paris Agreement. And the first time they were really mentioned was COP28, where countries agreed to transition away from fossil fuels, which is not quite as strong of language as we would want to see as like actually ending fossil fuel production. We're also paying attention to work that's happening around a just transition and making sure that communities who are going to be impacted from the transition, from workers to countries which economies are dependent on fossil fuels, to indigenous peoples, to communities on the front line of fossil fuel extraction and refining, that all of these groups have a voice in what a just transition would look like, and that countries are listening to those on the front lines of fossil fuel production and the climate crisis at large, in terms of how a just transition is envisioned and implemented. And then, yeah, climate finance is a big one. There's, again, like multiple different ways of calculating how much we being the US and other global north countries owe to communities that are on the front lines. But the gap in fossil fuel financing is in the trillions every year for as long as it takes to do adaptation work and mitigation work. And yeah, the different funds that have been proposed are not adequately filled from a loss fund, which would help communities that have already experienced impacts due to the climate crisis, to new funds that would help countries to actually transition their economies away from fossil fuels. There's a lot of additional financing that is owed. And yeah, and then maybe sort of the undercurrent of all of that is that within the UNFCCC framework, we'll often talk about common but differentiated responsibilities, which is the idea that addressing the climate crisis is something that is going to require international cooperation and that we're all in it together, but that countries that hold historical responsibility for causing the climate crisis have the most responsibility to pay, and should be on issues like fossil fuel phase out moving first and fastest. But that's a bit difficult to see implemented when the US is not actually sending a formal delegation to COP this year. We have subnational leaders that are attending, but we don't have a formal delegation. And then, sorry, just one last thing to say, which is the nationally determined contributions, which is every country's plan for how it will meet the goals set out in the Paris Agreement. They submit them every 5 years. They were supposed to submit them for 2025. Several countries are late in submitting an NDC, and the plans laid out in the NDC are nowhere on track towards what would actually be necessary to meet the 1.5 degrees Celsius goal, despite the fact that, yeah, we urgently need countries to start taking action, and there's not that much on fossil fuel phase out in them. And then maybe just one more bit of context to add is that all of this is happening in the same year that the International Court of Justice released its advisory opinion on climate change, which reaffirmed that countries have a legal obligation to meet this 1.5 degrees Celsius target. And so, yeah, it's not just that countries aren't doing what they should do, they are failing to meet their legal obligations based on the Paris Agreement, which they negotiated a decade ago. And so all of that is, yeah, things that we're paying attention to at COP. this year. And so then the question is sort of, where does the fossil fuel treaty campaign fit into this? And really the idea of the fossil fuel treaty is that there is just not enough attention to the issue of fossil fuel production within the UNFCCC space, despite the fact that it is really urgent in order to actually meet the goals laid out in the Paris Agreement. If you think about like the Paris Agreement as the what we need to do, a fossil fuel treaty could be the how we are going to do it. It would be a work plan for how countries would actually begin to phase out fossil fuels. And so, yeah, it's the Fossil Fuel Treaty is a global campaign that's calling for international cooperation around three key pillars: non-proliferation, so ending all new fossil fuel projects, fair phase out of existing projects, and a just transition for
2 minutes.
Great, thank you. For the communities that are impacted. And it's an idea that is gaining rapid momentum around the world. Currently, we have 17 countries that have joined the bloc of participating nations, really led by the Pacific Islands. Tuvalu and Vanuatu were the first to propose a treaty banning new fossil fuels. And then Colombia has really been a leader in this space as well. And Colombia has announced that in April, they will be hosting the first international diplomatic conference on fossil fuel phase out, which is really exciting and is a chance for countries to really start discussing creating a work plan around phasing out fossil fuels, and in particular, starting to discuss what types of modalities might be used to discuss a fossil fuel treaty. In addition to the endorsing nations, we've also had cities and subnational governments from around the world. I think we're close to 150. And in the US in particular, 3 states, California, Maine, and Hawaii, have all endorsed the call for a treaty, along with cities like LA, Austin, Pittsburgh, and Philadelphia, and Chicago have all endorsed in the last year, which is quite exciting. So it's an idea that's really gaining momentum, and yeah, it's supported by thousands of civil society organizations, academics, Nobel laureates, et cetera, around the world. And so, yeah, we're really campaigning for this to be the work plan how we would do fossil fuel phase out, which we know is really critical in order to meet the goals of the Paris Agreement. So I can pause there, and then if there's any additional details about the campaign and what we're up to at COP, but then also what we're doing in the US context, I'm happy to answer some more questions later.
Thank you, Rachel, who is the global coordinator at the Fossil Fuel Treaty Initiative. Up next, we're going to have Holly Kaufman, who's with the Plastic and Climate Project. And the goal of the project is to help estimate the extent to which plastics and their associated petrochemicals contribute to the global average temperature rise. Holly is a senior fellow at the World Resources Institute, and she was a nominator for the Prince William's Earthshot Prize, and she also published one of the earliest articles on why plastics are also a climate issue. Holly.
Thank you. And forgive me, this is the first time using this laptop, and there we go. Now I'm back. I really appreciate being invited to speak to you, and I'm really happy to get to follow Rachel and precede these other panelists. I'm a big advocate of the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty, and it actually relates to the work that I've been doing. As Mark said, I run developed and run the Plastics and Climate Project. And just to tell you very briefly what that is that I spent 30 years, so Rachel's lifetime, from the first COP, from before the first COP, working on climate change. I was a negotiator in the Clinton administration. And then about 8 years ago, fell into working on plastics, but started to realize the connection between the two issues, because they are both plastics are basically fossil fuels. But you would hear about greenhouse gases related to plastics, as you do from other heavy industries. But I would hear a lot of sort of speculative talk about, well, they could be impacting the ocean's ability to sequester carbon, but I could never find really data about that. So I launched this project with a PhD scientist, and what we did was review all the peer-reviewed literature on what existed on the climate impacts of plastics. And we identified what is known, what is not known, where all the data gaps are, and developed a scientific research agenda that would be needed to fill in all the data gaps. And now we're also working on the policy side of it, including here at the international level with COP30. So let me just see if I can share my screen. Help. Okay. As I said, this is new to me. I think this is what I want. Oh, God, help me. So sorry. I apologize for this. Just give me a moment and I will try to make it happen. I did a little rehearsal before. Okay, here we go. Okay. There. All right. Now I think I can do full screen. Can you all see this? Mark, can you see this?
Yes, we can see it.
But we have this.
There are three things. You come in twice, but we can see the plastic screen.
But you see me twice?
See you twice, yes.
Oh, well, I only see me once, but twice is better, I guess. Okay, so I'm going to play you this little 70-second. What's that?
Doesn't someone have to do a screen share to bring it up to size for all of us?
This is the full size, I think, unless you can't see it.
It's not taking up my whole screen is all I mean.
Okay, well,
whatever.
As long as you can see it, I think I'll just keep going. So here's a very short clip that will briefly explain the three categories of climate impacts of plastics, because there are more than just greenhouse gases. Even if we stopped all plastic production, use, and waste today, many of the climate impacts of plastic would not only continue, but continue to increase. As demand for conventional fossil fuels declines, the fossil fuel industry has pivoted to plastics and petrochemicals. In fact, plastic production is expected to triple by 2060. If the plastics industry were a country, it would be about the fifth largest emitter of greenhouse gases. And we know that those emissions are being undercounted because we don't count them through the whole life cycle. The three categories of climate impacts of plastics are greenhouse gases, as I said, carbon sink impacts, which are critical, and the radiation budget impacts. The radiation budget is the exchange of energy between the Earth and the atmosphere. So there are three ways that plastics affect climate change, and we're only counting part of one of them. But the existing data do show that the overall trend is warming. We all need to help raise the awareness of the climate impacts of plastics and make the connection between these two issues. Oops. There you go. Okay. My apologies. I just have, here we go. So I think that's a very good introduction. And then I just want to explain a little bit about the definitions, the difference between plastic waste and plastic pollution, because people tend to think of plastic as a waste problem, but it is ever so much more than that. That's not to discount the fact that plastic waste is a huge problem, and there are huge health problems, there are huge environmental justice problems, but what we're focused on in terms of the climate impacts is that there is pollution through the entire plastic life cycle, from the time of extracting fossil fuels through manufacturing the plastics, through when you're using plastics, they are causing climate impacts, which I will get into. When you are managing the waste, there are climate impacts. And when you're not managing the waste and plastic is just littered, or it's in rivers and oceans or on land, it is also creating a variety of climate impacts. So there are various forms of pollution from plastics, and the climate pollution takes place through the entire life cycle, which is a life cycle that never ends, because synthetic plastics made by human beings with fossil fuels is a material that nature cannot absorb, and basically it never goes away. So we often hear that 99% of plastics are made of fossil fuels, which is true. The category of, quote, bioplastics, which is a whole other topic, is only about 1% of what's on the market. So the majority of plastics are made out of fossil fuels. But that in itself is not what causes all of the climate impacts from plastic. It certainly does, where plastics are like other heavy industries, where there's extraction of fossil fuels and a lot of energy used for processing. But so there's some combustion involved in producing plastics, and there are leaks, like methane leaks. But plastics are different in that the climate impacts also occur without combustion. So plastics are constantly emitting greenhouse gases, and just their chemical and physical properties, by breaking down into microplastics, which are aerosolized and get into the air and the atmosphere, and which get into soils, plants, blue carbon ecosystems and oceans, and are affecting those systems' ability to sequester carbon. Those are also climate impacts. So as far as COP30 goes, since that's our subject for today, the UN climate treaty negotiations, the plastics' role in climate change is just really starting to get some attention. Only 14 countries, though, have national country level data on their plastics industries. Usually plastics are included in a country's chemical industries. 2 minutes. Oh my goodness. I'm gonna then just hurry up. Okay, so as Rachel mentioned, countries every 5 years, and this is one of those years, have to submit their nationally determined contribution. So how much are they going to contribute to reducing emissions to help solve the climate problem? So the European Union's new NDC actually says that they want to combat the environmental impact of plastics over their life cycle, including on climate. So that's a start. The Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development do say that plastic production and waste contribute to greenhouse gases. But as you will see from these are only focused on the greenhouse gases. They're missing the category of climate sinks and the impacts to the Earth's radiation budget, and the fact that climate impacts take place at every single stage of their life cycle, as I said. So unfortunately, we don't have much time here. So I'm going to just skip ahead if I can get my slides to move. Okay, I would have gone into more information on each of the categories of impacts, but let me just say that the takeaways are there are data gaps in all three categories, even including in the greenhouse gases, as I mentioned, because we really only measure at production and at certain forms of waste management. So we're undercounting the greenhouse gases. We're not counting at all the impacts to carbon sinks, which is really important when we want to talk about natural carbon, restoring natural systems to sequester carbon. We do know, however, that the direction is warming, and we really need to work on measuring these impacts. We have prepared a 2-page document to recommend to delegations what we want to happen at the UN level. And I am going to give you the link to that. Here's our peer-reviewed paper and our summary report for more non-technical audiences. If you want to take a picture of this QR code, you'll be able to get to our website and to these documents and to the 2-page policy document that we're going to be giving to delegations at this coming COP, so that they can call for the final decision that comes out of a COP to adopt the recommendations we have, so that the IPCC studies and includes the full range of climate impacts of plastics, and that for the next round of NDCs, countries are reporting on all of their climate impacts from plastics through every stage of the life cycle. And there's our website, www.plastic plasticsandclimate.com if you haven't taken a photo of the QR code. And with that, I will wrap up. But as I said, there's a lot more information there on the website and copies of all of our documents. So thank you very much.
And thank you, Holly. Up next is,
I'm going to stop screen sharing. Sorry about that.
and there we go, is JL, am I pronouncing this right? Andrepont?
That's right.
Okay. And she's been they have been senior policy analysts at 350.org for 5 years with a focus on providing strategic policy and political analysis to inform how 350 drives their support of the climate justice movement in the United States. They were a climate policy PhD candidate at Oregon State University, and they previously worked in city governments and nonprofit management, and they have been a grassroots organizer for over 25 years, and perhaps most importantly, raised in Texas. So, JL, take it away.
Thank you very much, Mark. Hello, everyone. I'm JL Andrepont. I'm the Senior Policy Analyst for 350. Thank you for allowing me to join tonight and give a quick presentation about 350 and COP this year, the People's COP. I want to quickly cover 3 topics, and then I'd be happy to take questions later. 1. Why COP still? 2. Indigenous leadership. And 3. 350's demands for COP this year. So, why COP 30 now? Why COP still? Many have asked year over year after year, especially as we hit the 3rd decade of COP, with emissions and warming still rising, as Holly was just talking about, and a very contentious geopolitical environment that Rachel was mentioning earlier. Why are we still doing this if we're quote unquote not winning? But as the saying goes, if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. Because if the fossil fuel industry is going to be there, if big tech is going to be there, if big ag is going to be there, if petro-state bad actors are going to be there, then we have to be there too, to be part of the counter narrative that is still demanding climate action and being part of grassroots action in person and online, pushing our friends and our foes alike to do more, to follow through, to not fall for the false solutions, to keep the fates of our most at-risk siblings around the globe at front of mind and heart, in a landscape that is growing more difficult for civil society to function, with a geopolitical landscape that is showing the cracks in multilateralism. We must acknowledge the challenges of today without backing away from those challenges to diplomacy, to global action, and to peace. We must support the global institutions that strive for interconnectedness, even as flawed as they are and can be. That is why we still go to COP. That is why we engage with it online. And that is why we highlight its importance to our members at 350 and with our fellow movement partners, several of which are on this call. So that's point 1. Point 2, Indigenous leadership. Since COP26, fossil fuel lobbyists have been a growing presence, and democratic space has been shrinking in the summit. COP30, or what is being called People's COP, and the COP of the Amazon presents a great opportunity for that cycle to stop. COP30 can be the moment to catalyze a level of collective focus that the climate movement hasn't had in years and bring about political action to follow. Indigenous peoples consistently show up in spaces dominated by rich countries' interests and fossil fuel lobbyists, all while facing the brunt of climate impacts at home and protecting and caring for the biggest carbon sinks in the world. We are leading the world in climate solutions, walking the talk, while for too long, too many have been satisfied with just talking the talk. Indigenous alliances like the one between the Amazon and the Pacific are exciting opportunities for global South solidarity and the preservation of dignified multilateralism, which could not come at a more crucial time, as the caretakers, traditional knowledge holders, and stewards of the planet we live on. Indigenous peoples are the moral authority that should set the benchmark for climate negotiations. And third, what are 350's demands this year? 1. Triple renewables in a fair and equitable way. A just energy transition means renewable power that is accessible, affordable, and community controlled, not dominated by corporations or driven by profit. It means workers and communities are protected through democratic governance and support systems that ensure no one is left behind in the shift to clean energy. COP30 must deliver a clear roadmap to phase out fossil fuels, triple renewable energy, and ensure rich nations pay their climate debt through public, not private, finance. Energy solutions must uphold indigenous rights, center equity, and transform systems. 2. Rapidly and equitably phase out fossil fuels for a just transition now. Ending fossil fuel expansion is a non-negotiable step toward climate justice. Wealthy nations must lead with the fastest and deepest fossil fuel cuts in line with their historic responsibility. It must happen, and it must happen now. And third, lastly, there can be no climate justice without indigenous and traditional leadership at COP. While countries rush to cut emissions, indigenous lands and people have been doing so for centuries without polluting. Indigenous and traditional communities are the guardians of nature and are the climate leaders of our time. That is why, with COP30, the People's COP, being hosted in the Amazon, the indigenous movement launched the campaign, We Are the Answer. It reminds us that the real solutions to the climate crisis will not come from governments captured by big polluters,
Two
but from
minutes.
people and communities that have been defending life for centuries. So thank you so much for listening, and I'm kicking it back to Mark. I look forward to your questions later.
Okay, thank you very much, JL. And our final speaker gives a little bit about the COP diversity is Maureen Doyle, who is on EcoAction and so go ahead, Maureen, and from the Rainbow Greens in Massachusetts.
Okay.
Where did I do
Hi,
that?
everybody. I have been working with the the Global Greens Biodiversity Working Group, and I have learned so much. And they're all great. Uh, they've they contributed to this talk. It's a real collaborative group. I think it's great. Um, and I wanted to share with you all first some good news. Somebody mentioned the Earthshot Prize and the High Seas Treaty, which the Global Greens Biodiversity Working Group was supporting and trying to get finalized. Finalized. They are an Earthshot Prize 2025 finalist. And this is great publicity as we need to get this treaty ratified by each signer, and that includes the United States. But what I wanted to tell you about is following a landmark decision at COP16 in Cali. This is where the confusion about all the COPs is, but it was COP16 last year in Cali, Colombia, Conference of the Biological Diversity, or CBD, parties adopted a new program of work of the convention related to indigenous peoples and local communities. And that's called Article 8J. The historic first meeting held in Panama concluded on October 30th of this year and set about ensuring meaningful where I lost my space. Oh man. Oh well. I want to tell you about the recent intersessional hearing which was held in Panama, and it's called the Subsidiary Body on Article HJ and other provisions of the convention related to indigenous peoples and local communities. And that's just abbreviated as SBHJ, which is much easier to say. And that replaced a previous ad hoc group that was working on that. And SBHJ has a mandate to provide advice to the Conference of the Parties, COP. The first meeting of the SBHJ took place from 27 to 30 October of this year in Panama City. That was the first one. And instead of traveling to Panama for this intersessional meeting, I was able to watch the video recording of this momentous event on UN TV. Anybody can watch it there. And there are many different languages spoken, but UN TV translates into my spoken language. And there are many to choose from, so anybody can watch anything. The commencement of at the commencement of 8J was a dance by the Kuna people, the Nugapoi dance, which means lament of the grandmothers. A native woman introduced this dance as to the great mother, great father, and brother son, which asked for forgiveness for not keeping the earth healthy. And I thought this was a great way to start this first biodiversity COP meeting, to include the indigenous people who own 27% of the Earth's land, but 80% of the biodiversity. And Anita Tazek, who's a Mayan leader, she said that at the COP. And Dorothy Nugbega, who's from the Global Greens Biodiversity Working Group, added to me, in a world increasingly threatened by the climate crisis and the growing loss of biodiversity, indigenous people are emerging as essential allies in the fight to preserve life on Earth. Their territories, which make up just 22% of the planet's surface, are home to 80% of the Earth's remaining biodiversity. This statistic is not just a coincidence, it reflects centuries of respectful coexistence with nature, sustained by traditional knowledge systems deeply rooted and passed on from generation to generation. The inclusion of HJ will elaborate and finalize will finalize the nature will finalize the HJ, sorry about that, modus operandi, which will provide advice on traditional knowledge for the global report for its implementation. And I can send this all out to you because I have a link there. This modus operandi has been worked on since its creation at Cali last year and will be implemented at COP17 in Armenia next year. The agenda for the current meeting was created during the last year COP16 in Cali, Colombia. At various times through the recording of the HJ, phrases like the following were heard: all forms of life are connected, and there is no conservation without rights. There is no sustainability without justice. Acknowledging that plastic in the oceans, protecting natural resources, and maintaining access to their ancestral lands, there was acknowledgement that nature does not know institutional division. So I think I've taken up most of my time. But I'll end with Michelle Sheether, who's co-secretary of the Global Greens Biodiversity Working Group, summed it up this way: this meeting elevated the urgency of biodiversity crisis, particularly the leadership of the indigenous people and local communities in turning this back. Progress was made on the inclusion of traditional lands in spatial planning processes and environmental impact assessments. A further achievement was the strengthening of the legal framework for the involvement of the indigenous people and local communities in land restoration projects and protected areas management, conserving at least 30% land, water, and sea. Resource mobilization strategies need to follow to enable this to be enacted and include a human rights-based approach, capacity building, and technology transfer. Thank you.
We're going to add on the other presenters. If you don't have your video on, if you could turn it on so we could put you into the group chat, that would be helpful. We'll start. If people have a question, if you could post it in the chat. I did see one question, which was basically COP has been set up so you basically need all the parties to agree. And the question was, and that makes it very difficult, especially with some of the corporate fossil fuel polluters. Has there been any discussion about changing to majority or 2/3 vote or anything?
No.
That's a quick answer.
Oh, I didn't know if you could hear me or not. That is the case with the plastics treaty negotiations, but I've never heard of that coming up for the climate treaty negotiations.
While we wait for people to post a question, how optimistic are you that this COP really is 10 years after the Paris Climate Accords? how optimistic is it that this really going to make a difference and make a lot more progress than the last few COPs have made?
I mean, I guess it depends what you think the goals are of this COP, and what the expectations are. So, I mean, an international treaty that is consensus based is never going to do everything that we need to do on this issue. It has been critical, though, in getting countries, companies, states, provinces, subnational governments, individual actors to move. Because if we didn't have this as the background, like as the floor, I don't think we'd be nearly as far along as we are. So we've shaved off a lot in terms of projections. But I don't, if your expectation is, okay, all of a sudden at this COP, somehow we're going to stop producing, fossil fuels and the products that come with them, and we're going to stop destroying nature, because we leave that part out a lot. We need to not only reduce emissions, but we need to restore the natural systems that absorb carbon. Then that's not going to be the case. This is more looking at where is there funding for mechanisms for preserving tropical forests and the loss and damage fund, and looking at where all the nationally determined contributions come in and how do they add up. So those are more the kinds of things that we're looking at, rather than one meeting that's going to solve this incredible global crisis. That isn't what's going to happen. But hopefully it will be a very productive COP where there's a lot of agreement and we make as much progress as possible.
I see both Rachel and JL have their hands up, so we'll start with Rachel and then JL.
Sure. I guess, yeah, maybe just to go back to the previous question quickly, I similarly haven't heard of efforts to make the UNFCCC not be consensus based, but with the fossil fuel treaty proposal, how a treaty gets negotiated would obviously be ultimately up to the countries, but the idea is that you would have sort of a block of first mover nations who are ready to go, negotiating the most ambitious possible treaty from the start, and creating mechanisms that countries that they can use just within this the group of first mover nations. And in particular, the goal is to keep some of the blocker nations that were mentioned out of the conversation to start, to make sure that it can be as ambitious as possible. And yeah, I think having some of those blocker nations in the room does mean that the UNFCCC moves slower. And like oil production has continued to increase since the Paris Agreement was negotiated, in particular within US, Canada, Australia, and Norway, I think are sort of the biggest, the countries with the biggest growth in production. And so, yeah, we bear a lot of responsibility to move first and fastest on fossil fuel phase out, and probably are unlikely to actually be the ones to go first and push back on ambitious language happening in the COP space. But I do really appreciate JL's framing. So we'll be, really interested to hear their answer on why it's still worth fighting in the COP venue. And I do appreciate Holly's point that we would probably be in a worse off space if we weren't fighting in this fight. I think what makes me optimistic is that I think we're really starting to recognize that this fight just has to take place in as many venues as possible. And that means COP's going to exist. We show up to COP. And that means that there's subnational fights that we can be fighting. In the US, we can be trying to hold Gavin Newsom accountable to phasing out fossil fuel production in California. We can try to hold other states that have high rates of fossil fuel production and the ability to regulate that at the state level, rather than waiting for the US federal government to be willing to act because of their climate obligations for Paris. We can find ways as a movement to support the leadership of Colombia and the Pacific Islands and the countries that are ready to move, recognizing that like our country bears way more responsibility and it shouldn't be up to them to move first. But while they are willing to, we should be doing everything in our power to follow their leadership and to make sure that resources and energy are directed into the proposals that they're creating. COP is always a time for movement building work. And so
Yep.
I think, I mean, in particular, recognizing the situation that we are facing in the US under the Trump administration, if ever there was a time to learn from how other movements have won under harsh conditions, now is a great time to be doing that movement building work and learning lessons from each other. And so I guess just to say, like, do I think that COP30 is going to be the COP that ends the climate crisis and saves the world? No, absolutely not. But it's what we make of it. And there are still so many great things that we can pull out of this convening while it's happening. And I think
Yeah.
it's sort of on us as organizers to find the way to make the most of every opportunity that is presented to us. And so as long as COP is an opportunity, we show up and we fight and we learn lessons and we take them back and we show up to the next fight and on until one day we win. And yeah, with that, I'll pass it over to Jail.
Thank you, Rachel. To answer the question, the first one, I would say there are folks around the globe with varying levels of success demanding change at all levels of the UN, not just the UNFCCC. Why? Because multilateralism is hard. It is not easy to take all of the nations of the globe and try and pull them together in a room to talk about one specific issue with all of their different levels of interest, their communities, their economies, etc., their political environments, and try to come to some kind of agreement, whether it's consensus driven or not, to come to an agreement to make whatever you're working on better. Multilateralism is not easy, but that doesn't mean that we give it up. It is necessary on this earth to pull together every actor that is a part of this, which is all of us, to be a part of this fight in every capacity. As Rachel was saying, we have to fight everywhere, in every room, with everyone, all the time. Sometimes we win those fights, sometimes we learn lessons to take to the next fight. Sometimes we realize this is not the fight we need to be having in the first place. But that doesn't change the fact that we have to be there because, as I said, if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. We do not make change if we give up on the processes of change. So, no, this isn't going to solve the entire climate crisis. You can't solve that in any one COP or any one moment, anywhere with any one person. But what it does is give us an opportunity as a planet to come together and acknowledge we have a problem and we need to figure out how to address it with all of the voices in the room that we can have. Obviously, that's a little more difficult when the US decides not to be one of the voices in the room, but that doesn't mean, as Holly and Rachel have mentioned, we don't have subnational actors and other folks who have just as big of voices in the room pushing for change. We have to keep trying because there is no alternative, just like there is no other planet B.
Well, actually, to follow up with that point you just made, JL, that was one of the questions. What will the impact be of the fact that the United States is not having an official delegation at this COP?
My response to that is, when you have a president who is calling climate change a hoax, it's kind of hard to have that perspective in the room and feel like you're moving the conversation forward. Now, this is not to say that the US, as the second largest emitter, does not need to be present, which is why having numerous subnational actors at COP is so essential. But the question becomes, if President Trump and his administration were present, would they help the talks or hurt them? And so
True.
you kind of have to take it as maybe it's a blessing in disguise.
Right.
And we have to take this moment where we don't have these, I would say, disingenuous actors throwing their weight around in the negotiating room, taking up all the space, taking up all the oxygen. If we had this space without them, maybe we can move things forward in a way we have not been able to for, I would say, several years, because of the interests of the United States government are not always directly in line with what are the best interests for the planet. So I look at this as an opportunity for the global community to come together and not necessarily move beyond the US, because you can't succeed in addressing the climate crisis if you don't have the second largest emitter also trying to address the climate crisis. But it does give the rest of the global community an opportunity to lead these discussions in a way they haven't been able to for entirely too long.
Maureen, I see you had a question you wanted to pose.
Oh, I had put one in the chat to the fossil fuels people, not to be oppositional, but okay, getting rid of all fossil fuels is a really big ask for our society. Not that I'm in love with fossil fuels at all, but what do you propose as an alternative? Because even alternative energy uses a lot of fossil fuels in the mining and the production, in the transportation, and making new ones. You need fossil fuels for that. So I'm just wondering, what would you propose? Any of you can jump in.
Yeah.
I mean, the Green Party would say reduce, but
Yeah. Well, I mean, I guess to that point, like, I don't think you need to solve for how we'll get rid of the last barrel of fossil fuels before we get started on the project of reducing fossil fuel production, is like the short answer to that question. And I would say that, you know, actually, when you look at fossil fuel production and energy production itself, it's quite inefficient in terms of its own energy usage. To your point, like, so many fossil fuels are burned in order to ship fossil fuels around the world. So just to say that, like, there are some really easy places to start with the question of like moving off of fossil fuels. And I think that we have already, like, in production in the pipelines that exist around the world, pretty much enough fossil fuels to get us through the time necessary to figure this project out. So I think we're pretty safe to say we don't really need any new fossil fuel projects. At the very least, we can start there.
Or plastics production facilities.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
And then, yeah, that just means that making sure that we have, for the countries that, for various reasons, their economies are dependent on that fossil fuel production, or for whom opening their fossil fuel resources to international investors is like a requirement for international financing for their healthcare system or whatever. Like there's so many ways in which the ways that fossil fuels are baked into our system is complicated and financial and pretty imperialist in its nature. And so anyway, just to say that there's some pretty easy places to start. Easy as in like we don't need those fossil fuels, but there does need to be support for those countries. And then, yeah, you're right that it gets a little bit more complex in some parts of energy production. And we also want to make sure that we're not repeating the harms of the fossil fuel industry within mining for the various minerals that are necessary in order to do a just transition. I think we need to think about a just transition a bit more complexly than just like electrification of using the same amount of energy that we're using. And simultaneously, there are so many people around the world who don't have reliable access to energy in a way that is necessary in order to keep lights on in hospitals, in order to like maintain a minimum standard of life. And we want to make sure that we're ending that unfair access to energy around the world, that like equity is based into everything that we're doing. And so I guess, this is not a specifically like, here's the vision laid out answer to your question, but it is to say that there are some really easy places to start. So we might as well get started, and we might as well make it so that we're not solving the harder parts of the problem on a planet that is 3 degrees hotter, where the like energy needs in order to cool people down in some of the hottest parts of the world are going to be a lot higher. Like we might as well put ourselves into the best possible situation to figure out the harder parts of that. And that like specifically within the US or global north context, degrowth of sorts is going to have to be part of it. We don't need all of the energy that we're producing. There's no reason that I live in Washington, D.C. There's no reason that these buildings that are empty because no one works in an office anymore still have their lights 24/7. And I can buy fresh pineapple in the grocery store year round in the small town in Iowa where I'm from. There's some parts of our system that are way more energy intensive than they need to be. And if we just reduced how energy intensive they were, we wouldn't need to be mining and using fossil fuels in the mining process in the first place. And so I guess it's a complicated question, one that a lot of really smart people are going to have to get together to figure out, but there are easier places to start.
Can I ask a follow-up question? I don't know if anybody else
we're going to run out of time.
Okay.
Because we are trying to go at 9:15. I usually jump in at this point and promote my own book, putting out the Planetary Fire, which you can see for free on gelfny.org, Green Education Legal Fund ny.org. But if you really want the answer, get Mark Jeguson's book, No Miracles Needed, and he really outlines how one can. The problem is more political and economic than technological. So we're going to give each of the speakers about 2 minutes to finish up. So I'm going to throw out one last question, and that was, what can people be doing right now back in their own community to help, make the COP be more successful?
That's interesting. That's a really good question. I've actually never been asked that or heard that come up, but I think it's really good. I think the main thing to do is to press your legislators to support really robust climate action, and to make sure to vote for people who will do that. Because the way we get delegations to go to the COP and to be productive at the COP is to have, there's always, not this time, there is nearly always a congressional delegation that goes, in addition to representatives from the different government agencies. So when I was on the delegation, I had colleagues from all the various agencies. So I think, as well as I said, from Congress. And then we get a lot of state representation. I'm from California, and our state senator, Josh Becker, along with our governor, Newsom, are there representing California for the America is All In and all of the sub-national work. And, Josh is really there saying all the good things that California is doing. And so I think, that kind of thing is important. And it's important in this particular COP to be showing people that even though at the national level we're not doing anything, and I know California's done a lot of good things and some things that aren't as ideal as some of us might want, but we are still way ahead of a lot of places that, it's just really important to have those people in office at your public utilities commissions, in other lower level offices. So push the ones that are in and get more good people in.
So we want to give you, I don't know, 2-3 minutes to give a response, closing statement. I'm actually going to start off with Maureen because you're the last speaker, but there's also questions. Maybe you could address that question in your answer. And Mary Rooker says, hey, nice to have an agreement to conserve 30% of habitable land, but we need a whole lot more. So why not more? And then whatever you want to your closing statement.
Yeah, I mean, we definitely do, but I think the 30% that they're aiming for is great. I don't know, just like how I said, asking for all fossil fuels to be gotten rid of is a big ask. I don't know if it would be a big ask to get more, although there is logic in aiming high. So I don't know, Mary. I'll have to think about that. I know how to get in touch with you, so we can chat more about that.
JL?
Well, 350 is a members-led organization, and we have membership all over the globe. So I think it would be remiss of me if I did not say the best way to move COP is to keep talking about COP to everyone you know and demanding change in every way that you can.
Right.
COP is only as successful as relevant as it is. So as long as we are, as a collective, coming together, recognizing its importance, demanding change, demanding real outcomes from every single COP, whether it's the biological diversity COP that Maureen was talking about, whether it's the climate COP that we're all talking about that's happening right now in Brazil. If we actually stand up and use our power as people to demand change, demand the people who are in the halls of power recognize that they must listen to our voices and put our planet first, we can make every COP more successful than it would be otherwise. So that's my, I guess, rainbow response to that question. Thank you.
Holly?
You have to remind me of the question. I'm sorry. It's 11:15
No,
here.
it's a closing statement. Whatever final remarks you would like to share. Plug
Well,
your organization, whatever.
right. Well, I just am here to try to help raise awareness that plastics are fossil fuels and that we have to think of them as such. And so they need to be an important part of the COP and hopefully of the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty. And I appreciate it if everybody can help raise the awareness that plastics are creating more climate impacts than are currently accounted for.
And Rachel, you get the last word.
Yeah, I guess I'll say that, we won't be able to meet the goals set out by the Paris Agreement until we do something about fossil fuel production. And we need to make sure that the vision of a just transition away from fossil fuels is led by indigenous peoples, by workers, by communities, by countries that are dependent on fossil fuels for their economies for various ways, and not by the industries. We know what happens when industries lead transitions. We get boom and bust cycles, we get blighted cities, we get uh, infrastructure that isn't properly decommissioned and continues to leak into communities. We get negative health impacts. When we leave it up to the industry to decide our future for us, it's not a great future that we see. And so we really need to make sure that the transition away from fossil fuels is led by communities. And that means, similar to JL's point, like talking to each other about the role of fossil fuels in so many of the problems that we all care about, whether that's health impacts, whether that's war and conflict, whether that's climate change. Fossil fuels are linked to so many different of the problems in our communities. And part of how we will then meet the Paris Agreement is by getting a fossil fuel treaty, which is the work plan for how we will transition away from fossil fuels. And that means pushing for subnational leadership. That means getting your city council to endorse, your mayor to endorse, your organization to endorse the call for a fossil fuel treaty, and making sure that your community is aware of how fossil fuels are integrated into so many of the problems that we're collectively facing. And maybe just the very final point in response to what Maureen is saying is, I don't think that asking for the compromise has ever gotten us anywhere. And so if ever there was a time to say we just need to be so clear-eyed about what it's going to take to defeat the corporate interest, take people back from the billionaires, make sure that countries who are on the front lines, communities that are on the front lines have the power to determine their own futures, and to make sure that we actually do something about the climate crisis on the speed at which the world is warming. We have to be as big picture as we possibly can. We have to make the clearest, largest possible demand and figure out how close we can get to that, rather than saying, well, just from where we are now, what feels feasible, because we're always going to take a smaller step if we do it that way. And so if ever there was a time to say yeah, we're going to swing big, I feel like right now is the moment to do so.
I will just note that in our local community in Albany, and I assume many places around the world, Fridays for the Future is having their global climate strike this Friday, and our local Fridays for the Future are going to use it to launch their campaign to get the Albany City Council to endorse the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty. I will also note that both Pope Francis and the IPCC, in their own ways, have said that capitalism is incompatible with solving the climate crisis. And I think it's something we all need to be saying. And
all about profits from fossil fuels.
And I want to thank Maureen and JL and Rachel and Holly for joining us. We tend to do these the second Monday of the month. I believe the next one we're going to try to do is on the environmental and social impact of artificial intelligence. And I'd like to thank you all for joining us tonight. We will send out a video and then also any background information any of our speakers want to include. So thank you all and have a good evening.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.